Welcome to today's webinar on detecting and stopping cyber attacks against Oracle databases. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the Director of Business Development at Integrity, and I'll be the moderator for this e-learning session. The speaker today is Steve Coast. Steve is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of Integrity Corporation. He's been working with Oracle products since 1994, and for the past 14 years, Steve has focused on the security and auditing aspects of the Oracle e-business suite and Oracle database, and has written and presented on these topics at various national, regional conferences, including OAUG, IOUG, and the National Collaborative Conferences. Steve is recognized nationally for his vast security knowledge and expertise. I'll now turn it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Phil. So today's presentation is going to be based off of our experience with a number of clients who have actually had cyber attacks and their environments have been breached. And what we're going to talk about is how should you actually detect those type of attacks and how can you potentially stop them. So what we've done is put together some information based on real life experience. So looking at how cyber attacks took place in different organizations and what could have been done at those organizations to actually detect those and stop those. The core focus of the presentation will be against Oracle databases, but you can assume against any other sort of database these types of attacks would also work. We'll focus on Oracle because that's most of the people on the call today have Oracle expertise, and so does Integrity. So first we're going to talk about how and why you might be under attack. This is one area that most people don't realize when they're looking at what the threats are. What are people looking to do? How are they potentially attacking you? Then we'll start talking about targeted attacks and how those actually occur. Then we'll talk about prevention and detection of those attacks. And finally, we'll open up at the end to questions and answers. So before we get started, a quick overview of Integrity and why we know so much about this topic. Integrity was founded in 2001, and we specialize in Oracle ERP and Oracle database security. And we've got two lines to our business. One is products, so we've got a tool called App Sentry that actually scans your Oracle e-business suite and database environments to check for misconfigurations, default passwords, missing security patches. And if you're running Oracle e-business suite, we also have a product called App Defend, which is an enterprise application firewall, which helps protect you when you deploy Oracle e-business suite to the internet. But a lot of today's presentation will be actually based off of our services work. So we actually work with a number of large organizations doing security assessments, compliance, security design work. So most of this presentation is based off of those security assessments, breach investigations. And so we'll try to provide you some generic information based on how cyber attacks actually occur and what we've seen in the field. Another question we often get is, why does Integrity know so much about the security alerts and things like that from Oracle? We actually spend a lot of time internally at Integrity doing research and development. So a lot of the CPU bugs that are published by Oracle are actually found by Integrity. I think we've found something like over 75 security bugs over a number of years. So enough about Integrity. Let's get into the topic and start talking about cyber attacks against Oracle databases. First, we'll talk about the how and why. Why are you under attack? What is someone trying to do to your internal environment? And it used to be years ago, it was more drive-by type attacks. People would scan the internet and looking for targets and kind of go after those targets that they found when there was a vulnerability. Today, in the last year or so especially, the targeted attack is much more prevalent. And a targeted attack is someone is going after you specifically. So they've identified your organization as having something of value that they want. So they're going to target you versus just kind of finding a vulnerability by scanning large swaths of the internet. What they're going to do, and we're working with one client right now that's under attack, they will go after different systems, send malware in. They will try to do anything they can do to get in the door. And these targeted attacks can be what's called advanced persistent threat, or APT. So that's more of a nation state. Someone coming in, very skilled attackers. It could be organized crime, just looking to make $1, trying to steal some information, sell it off. It could be state sponsored. This could be China, could be Russia, could be going after something that you contain, such as defense secrets or something like that, that they're really looking for. Or it could be simple as, we just want lists of who's in your healthcare organization so we can use that information later on. Or it could be one of the hacker organizations like Anonymous, LulzSec, Legion of Doom, that are doing it for different nefarious reasons. They may be looking to make money, may be making a name for themselves. So one of these organizations may be coming after you. And the next question is, why would they be coming after me? Before we get into that, let's talk about malware for a second. One of the biggest misconceptions is that, oh, our internal network is secure. Well, we don't have our databases on the internet, so we don't have a problem. The problem is, since 2013 especially, malware is very customizable. So you think you've got your virus scanner out there looking for the latest viruses. The problem is what the attackers are doing today is they create a custom piece of malware to attack you. There's programs out there that what they do is they take a piece of malware and they just customize it enough so it's unique that will pass by virus signatures and things like that, and they can implant it in the systems in your internal network. The key is they're coming after you specifically, so they're sending out very targeted emails, they're doing phishing attacks, they're just trying to at least get a foothold into your network. And the rest of this presentation will assume that your internal network has been somehow compromised. And if you look at many of the recent breaches, if you look at Anthem, you look at Target, those organizations that were breached, someone gained a foothold into their network. They were able to pierce the perimeter network, and then they started looking around internally. And so our presentation today will make that assumption that someone's penetrated your internal network, which is a fairly safe assumption, and now they're looking around, they're trying to find the valuable information. And of course, valuable information is stored in Oracle databases. So now the assumption is they're going to be looking for some Oracle databases or other large databases to steal information. So what might they be after? There's really three major categories of information that attackers tend to go after. The first is credit card data, and they're just looking to do basic credit card fraud. If you look at the Target breach was purely based off of stealing credit card data, using that data to create credit cards, to buy things. The second is identity theft and tax fraud. This is becoming a much more significant area of threat for most organizations and people in particular, because what I'm trying to do now is use your identity to either open lines of credit or actually submit a fraudulent tax return. And then finally is health insurance fraud. Health insurance fraud is probably one of the areas that's growing the fastest. And basically, if I need an expensive surgery and I don't have health insurance, what do? Well, the next best thing is just to basically steal someone's health identity, go to a doctor with a made-up driver's license and a made-up insurance card that's valid. It will basically go through, I'll get my surgery, that's $50,000. I won't pay a dime because I'll just walk away. That's fairly easy to do if you get the information. So healthcare organizations are also under attack looking for that type of information. It's very interesting that healthcare is in 2013 and beyond, 44% of the breaches were actually in the healthcare industry. That doesn't mean that other organizations aren't under attack, but people are specifically looking for that type of information, especially organizations that might have valuable information, especially Social Security numbers, credit card numbers. So one of the issues that people start talking about is, okay, what's my data worth? Like, okay, what's someone actually going to get from it? And it's very interesting on how sophisticated this marketplace is now. Anyone who's very interested in this topic, there's a former Washington Post columnist who's now independent, and his name is Brian Krebs, and he actually has a very interesting blog called Krebs on Security. And so anyone who's interested in this topic should definitely be always reading Krebs on Security, because he really goes into detail. He looks at how this marketplace works in detail, actually buys credit cards, sees what happens. And so recently, especially with the Target breach, what happened was they're very, very sophisticated. So they'll take batches of credit cards and actually sell them very quickly and efficiently. So you can actually buy, if you are wanting to do this in Chicago, you can actually go on the black market and buy credit card numbers specific to the zip code in Chicago. And why would you want to buy Chicago credit cards if you live in Chicago? The key is the credit card companies less likely will find and block that card if it's actually being used in Chicago. If you steal a credit card from Chicago and use it in Germany, it's more likely to trigger the fraud detection at the credit card agencies. The key is if I can use a credit card in Chicago that's from Chicago, I'm very likely to pass by the fraud detection filters. And the key is if I do it quickly, if I breach an organization and use that within a couple of weeks, most likely that will not be blocked. And as you can see, the credit card price dramatically drops based on how fresh the data is. So I can get $20 to $45 per credit card number if it's fresh, if it's within a couple weeks and the breach has not been detected. But as soon as months go by, the breach has been detected, the credit card agencies know about the cards compromised, that data becomes very stale. So they actually have clearance sales to push that data out and then hopefully can bring in more credit card data. So it's a very interesting black market that's very active, very sophisticated, and as you can see, it's some money. So if someone's stealing your credit card data, they can, and you steal 1,000, 100,000, you can actually make some money off of this. And these are what they're selling it for on the black market. And the people who are buying each of these can potentially turn it around and use that credit card data to maybe make $500 to $3,000. Identity theft is another significant area. So if I'm just stealing first name and last name and social security number, that's typically can be used for tax fraud. Again, I'm only getting maybe $1 to $5, but when I start multiplying this by maybe stealing all your employee data for $10,000, or 10,000 employees for $1 to $5, I can now quickly make $50,000, $500,000 fairly quickly. Again, now if I can combine that with current address, date of birth, that becomes much more valuable, $20 to $40. And the attacker can turn, the person who's buying this data now can turn around and potentially make $3,000 or $4,000 off of it. And then finally, if I can go after your payroll information, that becomes the most valuable data, because now I can actually pass by some of the fraud filters at places like the IRS and actually submit fraudulent tax returns. For those people on the call who don't think tax fraud is a very big deal, in fiscal year 2013, the last year that there was actually data available for, there was 1 million fraudulent tax returns filed. So basically what happens is, on starting February 1, you can start filing your tax returns. And so anyone out there who I can steal their social security number for date of birth and address information, I can just on February 1 submit a fraudulent tax return and maybe get a $3,000 to $5,000 tax refund, and the IRS doesn't match that against anything. As long as that key information is valid, they basically start paying out that money. So I can just then have it deposited into a tax return. Well, doesn't the account that it's deposited into have to be valid? Well, I can actually do prepaid debit cards. I can deposit it to that. So it becomes very easy to do. In fiscal year 2013, $5.8 billion. That's a lot of money. So when people think this is not happening very often, this is happening all the time, and it's a fairly serious problem. In fiscal year 2014, some people estimate these numbers will be double. So people are making big money off of this, and all they need to do is go into an organization, breach their payroll system, and they have more than enough information to do thousands of these. And the IRS is not doing much about this at this point. If you read the Krebs Security blog, you'll actually read some horror stories about what happened, and people have traced through about how this actually worked and how easy it was. People are shocked at how easy it is to actually do IRS tax fraud. And you can get $3,000 to $5,000 per name. So, and just make 10, 20, 30 names, and you just have to file that many tax returns. You can make $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 in maybe 1 or 2 days. So one of the keys is, when you're now talking to your risk compliance people, the key is now you can actually put some values. If you just look at the black market value, this is not the end value that somebody will potentially make. This is just the black market value. So the attacker who's actually compromising your system, how much are they going to make? How much can they potentially get? And now you can actually put a conservative value. I would say these numbers we have here for $10 per credit card number are pretty conservative but realistic. So if you've got 100,000 credit card numbers in your database, that might be worth $1 million to somebody if they're unexpired. Again, with social security numbers, just start looking at your database and how many social security numbers do you have and how much bank account information do you have. Is that valuable information? And start multiplying it out, and you can see that somebody can do something with that. Well, you think, well, how much would it cost for me, or how much would I be willing to make to do this? You really shouldn't be looking at that, because I kind of think maybe $250,000 for an American to do this. Well, don't forget, the person's probably not in America. They're in Russia, they're in Romania, they might be in China. So the economics are very different for them, because the likelihood of someone getting prosecuted in Russia for hacking an American database is probably very low. So they may be willing to do this for $20,000, $30,000, because I can do that in a couple days, maybe a week. I just have to do that 5, 10 times all year long, and I can make a lot of money with very little risk to me personally. If you're talking about an American, probably not willing to take that risk, but if you're talking about somebody sitting in Russia who's underemployed, who's well educated, this is very lucrative for them. So anyone who underestimates the risk to the organization of someone coming in and trying to steal this information, that's very naive. You need to really think about what's happening here, what's happening in the world, and what the risks to your databases are. So that's a little bit of background, trying to give you a little perspective of why someone's after your data, and hopefully it kind of opened your eyes a little bit and said, oh, yeah, I can see why somebody might be after what I have in some of my key databases. So now let's talk about the targeted attack. We're making the assumption here that someone's compromised your internal network. So there's a number of methodologies or kind of steps that people would take to actually attack an organization. And I've kind of boiled those down. There's probably 5 or 6 different versions of this, but I kind of simplified them. And there's really a 5-step process. The first step is they're looking for a point of entry. They're somehow trying to get into your network and compromise that. Because the assumption here is your databases are on the internal network, and they're probably not connected to the internet. And so they need to compromise the internal network. And they're going to do that through a social engineering attack, a phishing attack, maybe a network compromise where they compromise a web application server and can get in. So that's the point of entry. The second step is persistence. So now that they're inside your network, so in case of a phishing attack, I've installed malware on someone's desktop, and that malware is now communicating back out of the network, and I can make that connection. Unless I've got some pretty sophisticated security tools, that's sometimes hard to identify. The story around the persistence is the Office of Personnel Management. That's been the recent headlines that they lost 30 million personnel files on people who had security clearances. The way that breach was detected was a vendor came in to give a product demonstration, and they actually started running their product against the production network and identified many, many cases of malware installed on many different machines. So it's sometimes difficult to detect malware just operating using standard antivirus unless you've got some malware specific tools. Finally, the third step is lateral movement. So this is basically once I've compromised the machine, I'm going to try to move around in your internal network, because what happens if that machine just goes offline or something like that? Typically an attacker wants to compromise more than one device or system and have multiple points of entry just in case one is detected, so that now they can basically keep their foothold into the organization and don't get knocked out. So the assumption here is someone's compromise your internal network. We're not going to talk about these steps in detail at all. What we're going to now talk about is what's the threat against the Oracle databases. How am I going to become the victim from an Oracle database perspective of this targeted attack? And so first they're going to try to do asset and data discovery. So now they're going to look for the databases. They're going to try to get breach into those databases. Very seldom are the databases the first step of the breach. Usually they're compromising a server, a web application, maybe someone's desktop. Then they start looking for the databases. And so how do they now look for those databases without being detected? And then finally, the last step is data exfiltration. So now that I've gathered up maybe gigabytes of data, in some cases, in terms of the Office of Personnel Management breach, they think there was a terabyte of data potentially stolen. How do I take that terabyte of data and get it out of your network without being detected? So these are the 2 steps that we're going to talk about mostly throughout this presentation. So the internal network's been compromised. Now someone's going to try to break into your databases. So what are the first steps that they're going to try to do here? There's 2 approaches that most attackers will take. One is a passive approach. I don't want to set off any alarm bells. So what I'm going to try to do is find the information I need. I know that there's payroll systems. There's potentially, if you're a healthcare provider, you might have databases of your insurees, things like that. So what I'm going to do is try to find that information by looking through potentially the knowledge repositories. You may be running SharePoint. You maybe have this stuff on shared drives. It may be just on open websites within the organization. So I'm going to go search through that and try to find as much information as I can. Where are the databases? Where is that information within the organization? The second approach is a very active approach. Now I'm actually going to be a little bit more aggressive, go after things. So I'm going to potentially look for DBAs. Hopefully I can now get into your organization's email system or directory. So I'll look for DBAs. I'll look for those type of people, and I may do phishing attacks specifically within the organization against those DBAs. Potentially try to install malware on DBA's machines. In terms of the Anthem insurance company breach, the DBA's credentials were actually compromised. So someone is able to steal that one DBA's, and the only reason they discovered that breach was the DBA was actually into a database and saw he was already logged in and said, I'm not logged in. I wonder who that is. And that's how that breach was actually discovered. So it's this happens. This is how these database breaches occur. Then finally, the last way, and I'll also demonstrate this one out clearly, is there's tools out there that can scan networks for databases. So typically an Oracle database is installed on port 1521. Many organizations don't change that port number. So if you have a very flat network, I can actually scan your internal network and look for databases on port 1521 or a range of databases. We typically look at port 1521 through 1540 when we do our network scans. So these are some of the techniques. So we'll actually try to demonstrate some of these. So the first step is potentially you're using some internal search engines. You might be using SharePoint. You might be using Google internally. And so all you'd actually do is go and start searching for TNS names files. So I'll actually show you a demonstration here. We'll go out to Google. And we'll just do a quick Google search. So here I'm just actually searching for, within Google for TNS names file. And I'm assuming this is on your internal network, but we'll actually search this externally just to show you an example. I did this demonstration recently and actually started clicking on some of these links and bringing back the data. And I said, nobody's databases here are actually externally available. And we tested one out and it actually worked. They have since taken that off. But some of these environments might be actually live on the internet. So if we start looking at these, I can just now bring up a lot of, I limited this to only educational sites. So a lot of these will be universities. So let's go to the University of Virginia. They've got a TNS names file out here that contains information on potential databases. I can now start potentially trying to connect to some of these databases. This is on the internet. We're assuming in this demonstration that this would be on your internal network, but basically it's kind of the same perspective. As you can see, there's many cases where I can quickly now find the information. In this case, there's at least 3 pages of there's 55 results of TNS names files on the internet. So very quickly now I can get information. Hopefully none of these databases are on the internet. Based on our previous experience, we won't try connecting to one of these. But that's how easy I can do it within an internal network. Just give you an example. So these are some of the things that we've seen actually attackers do. They just are looking in SharePoint, they're looking on file shares, they're looking around trying to get as much information as they can to try to find out where the information is. And then from that, typically I can figure out what type of database it is just based on the naming. Other times I can actually find websites that list links to databases and things like that. So one of the first things they're going to do is just start using some of your own internal resources against you. And again, remembering we most likely this is a compromised machine. They might have already compromised someone's desktop, so they would probably already have Active Directory credentials to be able to basically log into a SharePoint site and pull this information. Another area, they might be going to your internal source code repositories. This is actually always a very interesting one. We love to do this search. Again, you hopefully have all your source code in source code repositories. A lot of organizations keep those pretty wide open. In many cases, just as when Integrity does our security assessments, we'll connect to the source code repositories and we have access, just even though we're just doing a security assessment, and we start looking through the code. And one of the very nice searches is if you look for just alter user identified by, this will actually potentially show up passwords. For those of you not familiar, GitHub is a very well-used, often used open source repository. So for open source projects, they'll store their code in GitHub. So actually we'll jump out here now to GitHub and see what we can find in GitHub. So I've gone now out to GitHub and I can now go into GitHub and search code. So then I'll just put my alter user identified by. So this is the code to actually change a user's password in Oracle. So, well, this might be in some script somewhere. So actually we'll do a search on here. And again, we're assuming this is your internal source code repository, but as you can see, I've got over 1,000 hits in, and GitHub has a lot of code in it. But now I'm seeing hits on actually different SQL scripts that actually have alter user statements in them. Some of them are actually create user statements. So here, if you're running this program, well, the user step-by-step might actually have the password Oracle. So this is how easy it is. This is what people are trying to do to actually figure out, okay, now can I compromise a database? I've got potentially some now database credentials. Actually, we'll do the search again. We'll do create user here. Now I found 6,000 hits. So if you're using a open source application in your environment called LightSpark, well, wine owner might be the database account and the password might be lemonade. So if you installed this product and didn't actually change the default password that was installed, well, lemonade seems somewhat strong. Don't know how to change it exactly because I'm just someone installing the application, so lemonade still might be the password. So these are the things that an attacker is trying to do. They might use your own source code repository against you to find things. I can't tell you how many times we do an assessment, we look in the source code repository, we actually find passwords, and the passwords are the same in production. Well, the SQL script says it, no one thinks about changing it, and the password is hard-coded in the script, especially on the creation. And a lot of times those passwords are never changed. So these, all you need is a beachhead. Again, these are just little incremental attacks. So I'm just trying to find at least one account into a database, and then I can potentially do something else. I don't need a lot of information. I don't need to immediately take over the database. I don't need to go in and get the sys or system password. I just potentially need an account to connect to the database because it's much easier to hack an Oracle database with an account. Again, if I'm now, here's another option that an attacker might have. Let's say we're using SQL Developer within the organization. And if SQL Developer is being used and you actually check that Save Password button, let's go out to SQL Developer, there's actually a tool out there that someone's developed to actually decrypt those passwords stored in SQL Developer. So let's say I've got SQL Developer here, and so I've got it, and so in this case, let's say I've got a database, and I'll go to the properties and just show you. If I have this Save Password button, well, it's so much easier to save my password versus typing it each time, right? And now let's say the attackers compromised the developer's machine that has connection to a bunch of different databases or potentially the DBA's machine. Well, this little show password capability, if I go under File, and I've installed it, so in the presentation is the URL. And the presentation will be available for download from Integrity's website after it, and you'll get an email about where that is. But it installs this little feature called Show Me Password. So this is how easily someone can just steal the XML file that stores all the SQL Developer passwords, and these are very easily to be able to decrypt. These are a lot of our test internal databases, so we always like to keep really bad passwords because we check for those quite often. But again, how quickly it is to get those SQL Developer passwords. So the scenario here is the attackers compromised the DBA's machine with some malware. They've been able to get access to the machine. They see that SQL Developer is running. They steal the XML file that contains these passwords encrypted, and now they're very easily able to decrypt these passwords, connect to all the databases. So again, you should not be saving passwords in SQL Developer at all because it's so easy to gather this information. But these are how hacks happen. These are not made up examples. These are basically things that we've seen happen in real organizations and how they were compromised. So that's one way, a couple ways people get information passively. So the next step is actively. So how can I scan for databases in your organization? One of the recommendations we often make is to change the default port number from 1521 to some random number that's potentially higher. A lot of people will say that's security by obscurity, but what we're trying to prevent is just these automated attacks. I'm just trying to at least put up another layer, another defense against an attacker who's now coming to the organization. Well, let's say I can't find TNS names files. I don't know where the databases are, so my next step is to do an active attack. So I'll actually use a tool called Nmap, and Nmap scans the network looking for different things based on IP addresses and port numbers. In this case, I've actually given you the command line that Nmap uses. This is the command line we often use to actually scan for Oracle databases and organizations, and we do this quite often. And in this case, the port number I'm going to use 1521 through 1529. And you can go to the Nmap site and they tell you exactly what all these options are, but this is our recommended string. And then I'll just scan a small range of IP addresses here. You can basically scan thousands of IP addresses. We just did a scan for a client. We did about 4,000. We knew where their data center was. We knew there was 4,000 IP addresses in there. We scanned it. It took us about 15 minutes to scan those 4,000 IP addresses, and we found a couple hundred databases. So that's kind of what people are doing. So now I'm assuming I'm on the internal network here. So we'll clear this, and we'll just show you the script here. So again, this is a fairly easy Nmap, and so now we'll just run it. And what this is doing is just going on the net on this range of IP addresses and trying different IP addresses to connect to those databases and to see if there's a database there or something else is running on these ports. Again, we usually use for large-scale assessments, we would use port 1521 through 1540. In this case, I just know we have our databases between 1521 and 1529, and when you're doing it for a demonstration like this, you want it to run a little bit faster. But basically, what we've seen now is very clearly we found on this one host, I've very quickly found 4 ports. I can scan much wider. I can scan thousands and thousands of IP addresses. I can scan probably overnight an entire network. And the nice thing about Nmap, not only did it now find that I've got 4 databases running on this one IP address, it'll actually tell me that they're Oracle databases and what version number they're running. So Oracle leaks this information out. So now I can say, ooh, the 10201, that's an older database. That would probably be much more vulnerable than this 11106. But even though that 11106 is probably vulnerable also. So this would be a classic technique that someone would use, and all I would have to do is go in and change. Maybe I can say, if I want to scan this whole Class C address, I would just do something like this, and I can scan 255 addresses within a couple minutes. And Nmap has a lot of settings because the next question will be, well, can't someone detect this? Wouldn't all my internal network tools see this pretty quickly? We do this all the time. And I can only think of one case where someone from security actually came down and talked to us about, what are you doing? Very seldom is this ever detected. And Nmap is a very good tool and actually has a lot of settings that I could have this run over a week period. And it randomizes everything, does it very slowly, so it doesn't specifically trigger any internal intrusion detection systems. It's very different on the internet. People typically have their internet hosts much more controlled than their internal network. So the key is, would this be detected? We don't see it detected very often. And even on a small port range like this, typically if I just scan port 1521, that might actually make it past some of the intrusion detection tools. When you're scanning just one port, the tools aren't very sensitive to pick that up. So this kind of scan would probably get past many, many tools. And even if it does pop up, somebody in the Security Operations Center may say, well, it's just kind of an Oracle. What's going on there? I don't know what's going on there. And they'll kind of skip past it. If they see the same IP address doing a lot of other scanning, they would probably pick up on it. But if it just scanned for some Oracle databases, someone in the Security Operations Center might bypass that and just say, well, it's just a false positive or somebody was doing something. So that's kind of how Nmap. So if you wanted to find databases, that's a very easy way to do it. That's how we do it in a lot of our assessments when we're scanning an Oracle environment, looking for databases to include in an assessment. So now that I've actually got the IP address and the port number of the database, I actually now need to get the SID. So Oracle does actually have a little bit of security there in terms of needing 3 pieces of information versus like SQL Server, I can connect without actually having that SID information. In 12C, 12.1 and above for the Oracle database, there's actually an initialization parameter option that actually allows you to connect by default to a single SID. And you don't need the actually SID or service names for the databases. We strongly recommend that's never turned on, that you always are required to have the SID, because at least just makes it a little bit harder. Someone now has to go get both the IP address, the port number, and the SID. Again, this is another example that will jump out to Nmap. I'll clear this so you can see it. So again, all we're doing is running Nmap, but now we're just adding another parameter that Nmap will now brute force the SIDs. So Nmap comes with a lot of different scripts that allow you to do different things. In this case, this is a script that will now attempt to brute force the SID. And again, this is just provided, and the data here, I'll show you the data here. This is just a list of 700 different SID names that different security researchers have found over time and think, okay, a lot of databases might have that. So OEM rep is often used for enterprise manager. Oracle is the default. Hopefully no one's running their database with a SID of Oracle. So this is just a case where a lot of databases, and again, you're just looking for databases, looking how to connect. EBS prod is a very common one that we see. Again, I can just run this script fairly quickly, and it'll kind of go out again. It's scanning the same host here, but fairly quickly it can go connect, gather the information, and what it's starting to do now is determine what's running on each of these ports, and then it'll actually try to go out and figure out and test all those SIDs and try to figure out which SID is being used. Again, this is a very brute force, this is very noisy, but this would never be detected by any network security tool. And unless you're specifically looking at your TNS listener logs, this would never be detected unless you look at the TNS listener logs, because all it's trying to do is connect with that SID information. And so you're not getting a failed login, you're not getting anything, and the only place this indication is actually within the TNS listener logs that a lot of people don't even have turned on, and you're just getting an error that basically SID unknown. And unless you're specifically looking for that, you would never see this type of attack going on, and that somebody's trying to scan your name to get the information for the database. Brute forcing the SID does take a little bit of time, so this is a little bit slower, so this would probably slow down the attacker pretty significantly, and that's why they're typically looking for the connection information somewhere else versus trying to do it using a tool like Nmap. So now that I've identified the database, hopefully I've identified the SID, so now I need to get into the database somehow. So the next step is to try to find a default password. Integrity keeps some anonymized statistics of when we do security assessments, we actually gather up that data and correlate it to see, okay, what are we seeing? And this chart here says for Oracle default passwords, where do we see the most default passwords? And in this case, if we look at sys and system, very few people ever have that as a default password. The DBAs are very good at changing that. But now I've got DBMS and MP outlined. Those are installed in almost every database, and we see those default passwords very often. So again, the attacker needs a foothold into the database, so now they can connect to it. Now they need to log in. This is one way they find logins. And so this is a very clear case of where you can just scan the database, and there's a number of tools out there that can now connect to the database and try lots of default passwords. Let's say the attacker is able to find an account that doesn't have many privileges, but it can actually pull back potentially the password hashes. Maybe it's an older 9i database that DBA user shows the password hashes, or they happen to find an account with select any dictionary. So if they can actually download the password hashes, they need maybe a more privileged account. This is an internal integrity tool called AuraPass, but there's other tools on the internet. If you just Google Aura BF and some other tools, you can find similar tools. So in this case, I'm just going to say that the attacker was able to download the password hashes. And then they'll just run it through a tool like this, and as you can see, it's very quickly and easy to brute force Oracle password hashes if I can get into that and actually potentially find default passwords of other accounts. Again, now I'm trying to do a lateral attack. I might be able to connect to the database with DBMS and MP that has select any dictionary, and I can now get into the user dollar table, get the password hashes. Well, that doesn't give me a lot of privileges, but now I'm looking for more privileges. I download those, I put the password hashes in a tool like this, and now I can brute force it. Another scenario that we've seen is they've been able to get into development and find a development account. Well, the password hashes, if you're taking production, cloning it down to development, you're probably not changing every single database password. So now they were able to actually go into a development environment that had much less security, had some default passwords, steal the password hashes from there, brute force them offline, and now they were able to connect to production as a highly privileged account. We've seen that happen. We actually see that happen a lot with the developers doing that. Well, developers always need access to production, right? So they're going in on accounts that don't have the passwords changed and going in and doing this. So that's an example on kind of brute forcing passwords and stealing that kind of information. Again, Nmap is very powerful. Nmap can do this. It can basically go in and do password guessing all on its own. So it's a very powerful tool. If you don't want to use some of those, if you can't get into the password hashes, you can just use a tool like Nmap. This will connect, go in and basically try different passwords and usernames attempting to get into the database. Again, very powerful, very easy to do. So those are some examples. Now I'm trying to connect to the database. I'm just trying to get a foothold into the database, compromise it. As you've seen, I haven't actually used any Oracle security vulnerabilities. I'm just trying to use some weaknesses, some default passwords to get into the database, compromise it. There are a couple database vulnerabilities that may be unpatched in the environment. And I'm going to actually demonstrate two that over the last few years, very few Oracle database vulnerabilities can be used without a database account. Again, an unauthenticated vulnerability. almost every Oracle database vulnerability requires some sort of database login. Once I'm in the database, it's very easy to take over an Oracle database, but if I can't log into the database, it's very hard to do. There's two that were patched in the last 3 years. The first one is called the TNS poisoning attack, and this was a one-off that was actually released in April 30, 2012. And for most versions of the Oracle database, 11.204, below 11.204, this was not patched as part of a CPU and actually required a manual change. We see a lot of our clients do not actually apply these changes. And so this allows you to actually compromise all the information in the database by using a feature of the Oracle listener against the Oracle database. And I'll show you how this works. So what happens is I've got the environment. Again, we've assumed the internal network has been compromised, and so the attacker is able to take over a machine. And this could be as simple as just basically walking into an office, tailgating someone and walking in, then sitting down in the conference room and plugging into the network, or they can basically install malware on someone's machine and take it over. So basically, the attacker's on the network, I've got the user on the network, I've got the database. And there's a little program that they can download for free, it's open source, and they basically install this on the attacker's machine. And the first step is what happens, it's a very interesting way it works, and the way the TNS listener works is the TNS listener wants to basically be in a clustered environment. The database wants to be in a rack environment. It wants to share its load as much as possible. So if we look at the scenario, what's happening is the database allows anyone to start registering dynamically with the database to act as a service provider to basically load balance. So in this database, it's basically the listeners providing services just for the local database. But now if the attacker comes in, he can basically register his service as a load balance service, and now the database will load balance between the local host and also the bad guy, assuming that it's a rack environment. So what happens when the user connects? The user is load balanced between the local host and the bad guy. And so 50% of the connections will actually now start flowing to the bad guy. And so what happens in the attack is instead of connecting to the actual database, the user actually connects to the attacker's machine, which is acting as a database. That attacker just basically forwarding the information off to the database and gets the response. But the key here is the attacker can see all the information flowing to and from the database, and the attacker can actually change that data. So if the attacker just wanted to insert maybe, let's say, an alter user, if it's a privileged account, or do anything they want. So it's a very powerful attack that now the attacker can now start injecting data, capturing data, and doing whatever they want. And no one in the environment, unless you're looking at the TNS listener, the service is dynamically registered, would you ever know this happens. So it's a very interesting, very powerful attack that many people haven't patched because there was no patch for it. You actually had to make a manual change to the configuration. This is fixed in 11.204 and above by default, but any environment before that is not fixed by default. And so Oracle actually had 3 mitigation techniques against this. 2 of them work for environments below 11.204. Again, this was fixed by default in 11.204 and 12c. But unless you went through and actually implemented these changes manually, this may still be vulnerable in your environment. So I've included the MetaLink notes here so you can look to see how this works. And again, this is all freely available, so if you just go to this website here, Joax Coret actually published this out. There's PDFs out there, and all the code is actually available for download. So there's little Python scripts that are very easy to use, well documented, comments in the code, unlike probably your own developers do. Security researchers love to document things and put source code comments and things like that. So many of these attacks, if they are published on the internet, are very easy to exploit. So this is all the information, the URLs to actually access it. It's very easy to download. Takes a little bit of experience on how to work with it, but once you get it up and running once, you're like, oh my gosh, that was kind of easy. So that's one exploit. So now if we look at another exploit here, this was the stealth password cracking bug. So this one was actually released in October 2012. And so this bug actually allows you to compromise the database, and this was actually changed a while ago in the Oracle database. And what it allows is for me to actually steal the password hash and potentially crack it offline. So the key here is I don't have an authentication of the database, but what I can potentially do is connect to the database and grab potential information that will allow me to crack the user password. So this was actually fixed as part of the October 2012 CPU. So if you're patched to the October 2012 or above, you actually have fixed this. But if you haven't applied CPU patches in a while, this would still be vulnerable in your environment. And the main reason I'm showing this is just an example of how some of these security vulnerabilities work. So again, what happens is the attacker's on your internal network, but in this case, all I have to do is connect. I send in the username and I receive back a key. And this was basically a bug in the way Oracle actually upgraded the authentication protocol, and it did not do it in a secure way. And now the attacker is able to connect to the database, send some information. They don't actually even attempt to log in. They break the connection before you even see a login. So in your logs and things like that, you would never see any indication of this attack. And what they do is just connect as a bunch of different usernames. They can grab the session key, and that session key is actually compromised with the password hash, and they can, just as I cracked the passwords a few minutes ago, you can do the same thing with the session key and potentially get passwords if you've got weak passwords, default passwords set on different accounts. So again, just an example. Again, this was well published out. A number of the security tools actually have this built in. So I used Nmap. There's actually an Nmap script that allows you to automate this. And so within a couple seconds, you can run Nmap and test this for your database. So again, very powerful. So for the final part of the presentation, those were just how someone might attack the database. What are the techniques they're going to use? So now the key is, how do you actually prevent this? And Integrity's #1 security recommendation is basically limit direct database access whenever possible. If someone can't connect to your database, it's very, very hard to hack an Oracle database. So if I can't log in, I can't hack it. If I can't even see it on the network, I can't hack a database. It becomes very hard. I'd actually then have to find potentially a web application and do something like a SQL injection attack. So if you're going to protect your databases, and most likely they're in the data center, some sort of protection network-wise for the data center works very well. Unfortunately, this is very hard to do because I've got a lot of different people connecting to databases. I might have ad hoc users and things like that. So it takes some strategy, some planning on how to do this, but if you can do this, now you've reduced the risk. There's no reason that everyone on your internal network should ever connect to every single Oracle database. You should be able to limit that. You might have to use bastion hosts. You might have to provide some capabilities. If ad hoc users are connecting, they shouldn't be connecting directly. They should be going through another avenue, such as a reporting tool like OBIE, things like that. You can basically implement this. It does take some work and planning, but it basically dramatically reduces the risk of someone hacking an Oracle database. Other preventative controls is apply CPUs on a regular basis. Again, when someone's in an Oracle database, unless I have the latest CPUs, it's actually pretty easy to hack an Oracle database. The #1 avenue that we see for database attacks is weak or default passwords. The first thing someone's going to do is try to connect to the database using a bunch of known accounts. And there's a lot of database, if you just look for Oracle default passwords, there's spreadsheets out there with thousands of Oracle database accounts with default passwords. So all someone has to do is load one of those lists and try all those different passwords. And there's lots of different tools that'll just let me do that in 10 seconds. And then finally, just hardening the database overall, validating the configurations, making sure that everything is set appropriately. Again, for the default passwords, it's somewhat easy to check with the Oracle. So starting with, I think, 10.2, Oracle released the DBA users with def passwords. That's the best place to start, to check if you've got default passwords. Unfortunately, the Oracle View DBA users with def password is a limited set of accounts. I think there's about 600 or 700 accounts in there, but there's only one password. So it's checking for things like system manager, apps. But if I change the apps password for Oracle Business Suite to something like password, the DBA users with def password won't find that. So we always recommend that you actually use a third-party tool, something like AuraBF. If you just Google AuraBF, it pops up right away. Our tool that we sell, App Sentry, will actually check every single database account, but then it checks those database accounts against 1 million different passwords. So each database account we're checking for against 1 million passwords. So we're doing a very aggressive checking, because if someone can steal your password hashes, they can crack these offline, and they can run these for days offline trying to find weak and default passwords. So it's very important that you're checking these passwords, because this is what someone's going to do. This is the type of attacks we see. People are just finding your databases. They run a tool to check a lot of different passwords very quickly, or developers, or they break into a development machine, they pull those password hashes offline. They can spend a lot of time checking those password hashes. So it's very important to have very strong database passwords. So those are some of the techniques for prevention. Now the question is, how do I potentially also detect some of these attacks? The key is always to have a good auditing and logging framework. Integrity has published one out. So if you go to our website, integrity.com, and look under security resources, we have a very lengthy and comprehensive framework for auditing and logging. So we go through and talk about all these different attacks and how you can potentially prevent these, and we've thought through a lot of these different scenarios and said, okay, these are the things that we think you should be auditing and why you should be auditing. What are some of the alerts you should be generating? As an example, looking for failed logins. There's a number of key accounts in the Oracle database like Outline. No one should ever be logging into Outline. Well, if you have an alert on someone attempting to log into the Outline account, that becomes very powerful all of a sudden, because now I'm looking for this type of attack, and it pops up, and it's very clear that, okay, if someone tried to log into Outline, there's something probably going wrong in the environment. Someone's doing something that they shouldn't be. So the auditing and logging framework kind of provides that foundation for you. And if you look for key security events like logins and logoffs, unsuccessful logins, where's user account creation coming from? Privileged accounts, looking for things like granting of privileges to DBA. If you ever look at any Oracle security vulnerabilities, most often the prime example of an attack and the scripted example always does grant DBA to a user. One of the key examples is always grant DBA to Scott, because Scott is that example user that's often exists in Oracle databases. The password often is Tiger, because Scott's cat was named Tiger. Background on that one. But basically, grant DBA, if you start looking for grant DBAs and maybe review that on a periodic basis, it pops up very quickly that, okay, something's going wrong, because a lot of the default scripts, and remember, a lot of these attackers are not Oracle experts. They're just going out and finding some information on the internet. They're very good at penetrating your network, getting in. Now they're kind of not very good at Oracle. They're not DBAs, so they're just kind of downloading information, trying it out, and seeing what they're doing. So they tend to be somewhat noisy. It's always been interesting in our breach investigations. People are noisy on the Oracle side. They're very stealthy, very quiet on the network operating system side. They're very good at that. But when they get to Oracle, they tend to be a little bit more clumsy. So it's actually easier to detect them, because they're doing things like just checking all the default accounts or granting DBA privileges. And those things tend to show up very quickly in the auditing and logging. And that's why our framework is designed to try to pick up those events. What's out of the ordinary? What should be a trigger for these type of attacks? And then we mapped our framework also to a number of the compliance requirements. So it's very important to say, okay, what does this fall back on? What's important here? And then here's an example of some of the statements we're auditing. We also strongly recommend you're sending this off to an alerting system. When you start talking about auditing and logging, turning on the auditing and logging is very easy. That's about 5% of the effort. Now is, how do you send this? How do you alert on it? How do you report on it? Becomes much more difficult. But here's kind of some of the different audit statements that we believe you should be implementing to try to capture this information, seeing what's happening. So that was at a high level, just walking through if your databases are under attack from a third party, they're trying to come in. This isn't really looking at if your DBAs are doing something bad or your developers are doing something bad. This is if maybe China, Russia, someone's trying to get in and steal your data, sell it off on the black market, some of the things that they would do internally against your environment to attack it. What are they going to try to do to find the databases? How are they going to try to get into the databases? And then we kind of walk through some examples of some prevention and detection. So thank you for attending. We'll open up to some questions now, and I'll turn it back to Phil. And Phil, are you there?
Sorry, Steve, I had you on mute so I wouldn't bother you. First question. Does regularly applying CPUs fully protect my databases?
Yeah, so applying CPUs is one of those important things in the overall security picture. It's not the end all to be all. It's not 100%. It's not going to fully protect you. Again, just basic hardening, turning on auditing, looking for default passwords. Those type of things are as important, if not maybe more important than applying the CPUs, because the goal is to try to keep people out of the database first. The CPUs, and I gave a couple examples where you could hack an Oracle database without a login, but really the CPUs 95 to 99% of the time protect you if somebody's in the database. Once they've signed on to the database, if they have public permissions even, they can exploit a CPU. So CPUs are very important, but they are not the complete picture. You need to basic hardening, basic checking for passwords, turning on auditing, knowing who's connecting to the database are just as important, if probably not more important.
Question here. What are the options with CVE 2012-1675 vulnerability? I am patched on 11.1.0.7 systems through April 2015 SPU.
Yeah, so if we kind of go back, was this the correct number?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
so basically this is the one-off. So this patch was not included as part of the CPU patch. So this was a one-off patch, and so you basically need to go through and look at the cost parameters. And I didn't catch which version was it? Was it 11.203?
11.1.07.
Yeah, so if you're 11.107, you do have to implement the cost parameters, and the MetaLink notes are here. So if you just follow through those MetaLink notes, it's step by step of what you need to do. But if you have applied the latest CPU patch, you still are not necessarily protected. So you do need to look through the cost parameters and implement those as part of the MetaLink notes.
Another question. Can you encrypt the tsn names.ord a file?
That's actually an interesting one. Can you encrypt? No, for the TNS names or a file, it's basically always a readable file. It's basically a text file that you can actually read it. So there's really no way to provide that and distribute that within the organization in a protected format. Nice idea. Unfortunately, Oracle doesn't support anything that I know of, anything like that. Potentially, you can use some of the Oracle naming methods, but still, if someone can still get to those names, they can always connect. So there's really no way to provide that information out that someone would then have to know that name to connect, and that becomes fairly difficult. It's usually fairly easy. Protecting the TNS names or a file, that's as much to demonstrate that people can connect to your databases and can find the information. We don't spend a lot of time worrying about if we actually do find them. I don't want them on the internet. But if they're on your SharePoint sites and things like that, we don't spend a lot of time saying, oh, no, you should take those off, because someone can probably get that information other ways. It's important to have the database, the door locked to the database versus trying to hide the database.
Got it. Next question. What is exploited most often? Security vulnerabilities or default passwords?
Yeah, very often we see the default passwords as the avenue in the database. Much more, that is typically the avenue. Classic attack is always look for the databases, find the databases, try the default passwords, get in with a default password, and I own the database. That's usually the complexity. Very seldom do we ever see that someone's actually truly exploiting a security vulnerability. That does happen. It's not, that's why you still need to apply the CPU patches. They're still important, but 2/3 are probably, I just got into the database by something stupid, and 1/3 is probably, I was able to get into the database because of something stupid, but I couldn't quite do much more. Than 1/3 is I actually had to do something more advanced. It's amazing if you really look through any breach investigations and really get down into the details of what happened. Most often breaches are because of stupid things. It's not because, oh, this attacker was so absolutely sophisticated. It's no, they were just able to get in, they were able to poke around, they were able to find stuff, they were able to download it. It's not because these guys are so great at what they do. It's just because they found a weakness. And this is the classic case of it's the weakest link is the biggest problem. And they just hunt. They find that weakness, and the goal that you have to have is to find them before they find the weakness. Not that they're so stealthy and so great. Maybe some guys at the NSA are, and some really top-notch ones, but most breaches against Oracle databases are not that type of attack. It's not the NSA coming in after you. It's a team in China that's affiliated with the Army that wants to get all your personnel files and see who works for you. That's the type of attack, and they're able to find a weakness, exploit that weakness, find another weakness, exploit that weakness.
Next question. From a security perspective, how should I monitor our databases?
Yeah, so the key here is monitoring is the critical part. If you don't know what's happening, you don't know who's logging in, that's the weakness. Our recommendation is to implement the integrity auditing framework, but to send that data upstream somewhere. So we have a maturity model that we talk about, at least capture the data, at least start having it, but now start doing something with it. One of our favorite things to do is actually for the Oracle database auditing, you can turn on syslog and pipe the audit information to syslog, which is very high performing. It goes immediately across the network, and then you can put it into a tool like Splunk, ArcSight, and there's a lot of other tools that then you can capture the information in there, and those tools have very powerful reporting capabilities. So a lot of what we're doing with clients now is we actually are just turning on, instead of buying any tools, and a lot of this stuff is very low cost, you can just use the Oracle native auditing, pipe it to syslog, put it into Splunk. A lot of organizations are buying Splunk. Splunk is a very cost-effective solution, and you can actually, if you just want to use it for your DBA team, you can download Splunk for free, and I think you get about 500 megabytes per day. It's a very high number. You only keep it for 7 days, but then you just create some alerts, and if you see a login to Outline or DBM SMP or CTX Sys, you can just raise an alert on that. That's very easy to do, very cost effective, and very effective on a security perspective. Now you know who's logging in, you're capturing the information, you're reporting on it effectively.
Next question. My databases are in a co-location and require a VPN connection in order to connect with any database tools. What level of security does that provide?
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty effective solution. So if your databases are, and this could be on your internal network in your data center, this could be in a co-located environment, but any network restriction you can put in, and our preference is minimum is no one on your internal network can directly connect to the database. They need to go through some level of authentication, and one way you can do that is, and one way we like to see is, you basically have a VPN into the data center. So DBAs are able to VPN in and see the network segments that the databases are in. That makes it very difficult for all those ad hoc users that need all those read accounts, but now you've cut all that out. You've dramatically reduced the risk. Maybe you've then forced those people to go to a reporting server. Another option that we see quite often is there's bastion hosts. So for the DBAs to do work on the databases, they don't connect directly from their desktop to the database. They connect to a Citrix box. That Citrix box is controlled. They have to do an AD authentication into it, like through Active Directory. Then they have SQL Developer, SQL Plus installed there. Then they use that to actually connect to the database. They can then SSH from there. Again, not a direct connection, so now you've actually dramatically reduced who can connect, who can potentially scan for the databases, and now the attacker has to maybe potentially compromise that or go to the next step. So it makes it much more difficult for the attacker. So something like that provides, it's not foolproof, there's always ways around that also, but again, you're just making it as difficult as possible, putting up as much barriers, and hopefully at one of those levels, now you're potentially detecting the attack and can prevent it from happening, have to then identify where the malware is and then clean it up.
Next question. How can you tell if you have experienced a cyber attack? Our co-location experienced a DOS attack last week, but not aware of any attacks on our databases.
Yeah, unless you have auditing turned on and you're reviewing the logs, it's very difficult to know. Unless, as you can say on the Anthem breach, someone actually just saw a database login. So the goal here is always to have some sort of monitoring solution looking at the audit logs to say, okay, who's logging in? Is there anything out of the ordinary? And putting a number of rules in there to say, okay, were there too many unsuccessful logins? Were there logins to accounts that shouldn't be logged into? Those are the key alerts that you're looking for here. Monitoring and watching the listener log, uploading that on an occasional basis and parsing through it to see if there's lots of invalid SID attempts, those type of things. That's the key, is watching and trying to detect that information. Post-breach, if someone's gone in and stolen your data, a lot of times there's not a big footprint. We don't see a lot of people installing malware in the database, changing many permissions. Typically, most of the breaches we see is somebody's compromised the database because they found a default account. They were able to log in that default account, like let's say they were able to compromise an interface account. that interface account just had too many privileges. They were able to download all the data. After the fact, we could see a connection, but that's all we knew. We had no idea actually what they did, what they actually stole, because there was no auditing enabled. The account had too many permissions, so you don't really know what they did. The database got bound, so you don't even have anything in the $V SQL tables to see, okay, potentially what did they access, those type of things. So it's very difficult post-breach, unless you have auditing turned on, to know what happened, what they might have stolen or not stolen.
Okay, Steve, I think it just wraps this up for the day. I want to thank everybody for attending and taking time out of their busy afternoons. Now, we will not be having a webinar during July, or at least we have scheduled a webinar for July, August, but we will be back again in September. So everybody have a great summer, and we'll see you then.